Transnistria has been going on as long as the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, which in fact Russia actually just pulled away from it. It had backed Armenia in that fight, and I think the fact that it just walked away and left the ethnic Armenians to their fate, it speaks to their overcommitment in Ukraine, and being tied down there may stop them. May limit their ability to interfere militarily in other places.
To help us unpack frozen conflicts, I'm delighted to have the Times' World Affairs editor Catherine Philp with me. Catherine, we talk a lot about Cold Wars, hot wars. How do we define a frozen conflict, and how do they come about?
In essence, a frozen conflict is when it's usually when there has been a hot phase of a war, so active combat, and that ceases. For one reason or another. It could be through sheer exhaustion of the parties involved. It could be because an armistice has been signed, as was the case in the Korean War. But then it has not ended up traveling towards a full-blown settlement of that conflict. So North and South Korea signed an armistice that froze the conflict along the front line, along the 38th parallel, and then never got to any agreement. So they remain in a technical state of war. That's probably the most sort of famous current kind of classic frozen conflict. But there are others that, for example, Kosovo won its independence through a NATO intervention, and effectively, defeated the Serb army and became their own state. But Kosovo has never been recognized by Serbia, so that is also a conflict that is in essence in a frozen state because it has not been resolved. Kosovo is not recognized by its neighbor, another one is actually in Bosnia, because of, despite an enormous amount of peacemaking and enormous efforts put in by the international community into the Dayton Peace Accords, it has never been entirely settled by all the parties involved that they are happy with the outcome and happy to leave it as it is. So the threat of a frozen conflict is essentially that they can re-erupt at any moment. So they are not a lasting solution and a lasting peace.
Is it still worth pushing for them? I mean, in the Balkans, in the Korean Peninsula, it's been a sort of peace with tensions for a long time. Is it always a bad outcome?
It's not always a bad outcome, no. And sometimes it's the only way that you can prevent the killing going on. And so obviously, South Korea has done pretty well out of its frozen conflict. It had the good fortune to, so the war on the Korean Peninsula, the South was backed by the UN. And when the hot phase of the war, now the UN troops that went there under the banner of the UN were largely American. But when the conflict itself stopped its hot phase, thousands of American troops stayed in South Korea and are there to this day to ensure a peace there. And South Korea has done very well out of that because it went from one of the poorest countries to one of the wealthiest. So that's worked out very well for South Korea. Not so great in North Korea, which has made its own choices and has become a hermit kingdom. So, it's very much a case of which side of that 38th parallel were you when the guns fell silent, as to whether you think that was a good outcome or not.
The reason we're talking about frozen conflicts so much recently is because many are suggesting the war in Ukraine may be heading towards that kind of status. Has Kyiv been considering this outcome seriously, and how would they be preparing?
The reason it's been talked about in Ukraine is because there are it's because of that campaign boast Donald Trump made some time ago as he was seeking re-election, that he could solve that one, that war would never have happened had he been in office, and that two, he could solve it in 24 hours. Now, look, that was clearly a campaign boast, a campaign slogan. It couldn't be done, but he was, being maximalist in that manner that he likes to. He has now suggested to his now official envoy, Keith Kellogg, that he would like to see a plan to stop the war within 100 days. Now, again, that's a very short time frame. So what the Ukrainians are concerned about is that Donald Trump is not a details man, and that he also wants to see this war end. That's his primary goal, is to sort of get the deal, look like the peacemaker, and walk away. He doesn't much care how it happens and how Ukraine comes out of it. So Ukraine's fear is that it will be forced into an unfavorable negotiation with Vladimir Putin and with Russia. This has happened before. It has happened it happened in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea and fomented a separatist movement in the Donbass region. And that rumbled on essentially as a frozen conflict, reigniting very dramatically when Russia launched its full-scale invasion in 2022. So this is something that Zelensky has addressed recently and very explicitly. We do not want another frozen conflict. We had one, and look what happened. It's also been addressed by some of Ukraine's closest allies very explicitly, including Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission president, has warned of the danger of a frozen conflict on the European continent and what that would mean for the future stability of the entire region.
As you say, Crimea is an example. Transnistria, also very near to Ukraine. It's striking how many of these frozen conflicts are on or not far away from Russia's borders. Why has this become so common in that neighborhood?
It's no accident. It is literally a tool of Russian foreign policy to have these frozen conflicts, because it essentially, Russia has never accepted the loss of the Soviet Union, the states that became independent with the breakup of the Soviet Union, and it springs from a Russian worldview, which is one of spheres of influence in which Russia maintains. And then this is partly, the West is at fault here too, because it sprang from the Yalta Agreement at the end of the World War II, that each of the superpowers, Russia and the US, would maintain these spheres of influence. And so you see it in places like Georgia, where there was the invasion. There was a Russian invasion in 2008. Russia's held on to parts of former Soviet states like Transnistria, the sliver in Moldova, between Moldova and Ukraine, that's hung on to. And essentially, it's a way of keeping string pulling in countries that they believe should be within their sphere of influence, and sort of keeping everyone dancing to their tune.
One of those frozen conflicts in their sphere of influence was Nagorno-Karabakh, which turned hot not much more than a year ago. That was a decades-long frozen conflict with various skirmishes in between. How long do you think a freeze would last for Ukraine proper?
I mean, it's a great question. From 2014 to 2022, that's 8 years. Transnistria has been going on as long as the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, which in fact Russia actually just pulled away from it. It had backed Armenia in that fight, and I think the fact that it just walked away and left the ethnic Armenians to their fate it speaks to their overcommitment in Ukraine, and being tied down there may stop them. May limit their ability to interfere militarily in other places. But in terms of how long it would last, I mean, the classic sort of bad ceasefire is one in which the stronger party walks away, rearms, has a rest, and comes back to the fight renewed, and is able to sort of take time out to replenish its troops, its re-up its weapons and ammunition manufacturing, literally all of that, until it's ready to come back. So yeah, it could buy a few years of peace. The problem is for Ukraine that if it doesn't get security guarantees from someone credible like NATO, and which is obviously is a consensus organization, so such a security guarantee could be vetoed by any member of NATO, which includes the US under Trump. It also includes Hungary and Turkey, who might not want to do that. So without a credible guarantee, really, Ukraine would be just simply bracing for Russia to come back and wondering whether this time they would reach Kyiv. That was their objective in 2022, and they didn't get there extraordinarily. I was in Kyiv when the Russians first invaded, and we were preparing to see them within days in Kyiv, and they didn't get there. So I think that would be the top concern of Ukraine, is that if it freezes the conflict along the current front line, does the remaining rump of Ukraine have the wherewithal to continue its own, to function as an independent entity and to be capable of defending itself against another aggression?
Those security guarantees have kept some frozen conflicts going for decades. I'm thinking of Cyprus, where it's more than 50 years now. And I've lost count of the number of summits and talks I've been to where that, trying to unfreeze that conflict, has been discussed. Can diplomacy ever fix frozen conflicts?
I mean, there's no reason why it can't. It really depends on the interests of those parties, what pressure you're prepared to put on the different parties, and whether you can present something to them that appears like essentially a win-win situation. They tend to happen when obviously when there isn't a clear victor. I mean, that's why this is why the World War II ended, because there was a clear victor. That's why a deal was done that effectively carved up Europe. I mean, you could say that Germany, East and West Germany, were carved up in that agreement, in that Yalta agreement, and ultimately did unite once the Soviet Union collapsed and the Cold War was over. So yes, they can end. I think the issue in front of us right now is, because we're seeing this through the lens of Ukraine and Donald Trump in particular, is he hasn't got a great record for this kind of win-win deal making. He kind of trades in winners and losers. So I don't think we've really seen that many. I mean, I think maybe the Abraham Accords would be the closest thing he's got to a win-win, but between the parties who signed that, being Israel, the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. But the great losers in that one were the Palestinians, and who the deal was made over their heads. Now look how that went. You ended up with this appalling attack on Israel from Hamas. On October 7th, 2023. So really what you want to see, you want to be able to tell both sides that credibly that they have got something out of this deal, and that they have to feel that and be content with it, or it will come back, it will bounce back. I mean, another example coming from the Second World War, obviously, was the enormous amount of money that was put into the Marshall Plan and for the reconstruction of Europe and into Germany and and there were reparations, but there was also this sponsorship of, and I don't think that's something that we're likely to see in in any of these frozen conflicts, and that's problematic because you know if someone's a clear loser, you need to soften that blow for them.
which is, I suppose, the lesson that we got from Japan as well as Italy, and so on.
Yep.
While we're contemplating Ukraine's future here, the Times is reporting that the UK is going to take on leadership of the Ukraine Defence Group. That's a role the US has always had until now.
Mm.
Can we read anything into the Americans stepping back from heading this grouping?
Yes, we can. We can read into it that, no surprise, Donald Trump is true to his word that he thinks that Europe needs to step up and look after its own security affairs and cannot constantly expect America to be, the big brother, the policeman, and the main financial contributor to European security. So I think it's a good thing that that's happening because I think it makes it much clearer to everyone what the stakes are, rather than being surprised by it. I mean, it is what it is. I'm sure we would all rather that America continued to plow money into European defence and would come to the defence of Ukraine. But if it's not going to, it is time for to Europe to look after its own backyard.
Catherine Philp, thank you very much for making some time for us.